It all began on a quiet suburban street, the kind that looked perfect on the outside, but was slowly rotting beneath layers of manicured lawns and brittle smiles. The kind of neighborhood where the hedges were always trimmed to regulation height, and where the word community meant whatever the homeowners association decided that week. It was a place built on appearances, and no one guarded those appearances more fiercely than Karen Holloway, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board. When I first bought my property, it was supposed to be simple. A small half-acre lot on the edge of the subdivision, technically outside the HOA boundary. That detail mattered more than I realized back then. My parcel had once been part of the same development, but was left out due to zoning quirks. It shared a narrow gravel access road that cut through a sliver of HOA-controlled land, a forgotten strip of dirt and weeds the neighbors called the gate lot. It didn't look like much, but it was the only way to reach my property without driving through a ditch. I built my little place quietly, with minimal fuss, keeping to myself. The peace lasted about 2 months, right up until the day Karen decided I didn't fit the aesthetic of her neighborhood. It started small, with polite notes taped to my mailbox about community standards and voluntary participation fees. I ignored them. Then came the emails, the threats of fines from an HOA I wasn't even part of. And then, one morning, the sound of power tools. I remember stepping outside and freezing in disbelief. A group of men in bright orange vests were pounding posts into the ground, unrolling long panels of beige vinyl fencing, the kind the HOA loved to install to enhance property values. Only this fence didn't stop at the HOA boundary. It kept going, straight across the gravel access road, straight across my only driveway. I asked them what they were doing, but they just shrugged and pointed to a clipboard. "We're just following orders," one said, before driving another post into the earth. By the end of the day, my property was completely enclosed. The only way in or out was through the shiny new 6-foot-tall fence. Locked, of course, with a metal gate that opened only to HOA key fobs. I stood there staring at it, half expecting it to be some kind of prank. But Karen didn't do pranks. She did control. She had built the fence around my land. And technically, according to the HOA's plat maps, she thought she could get away with it. That tiny access strip, the one leading to the road, had been declared common area. And because my lot wasn't officially recognized as part of the subdivision, no one had bothered to document the right-of-way that had existed for decades. In Karen's mind, it was a simple equation. Her HOA's land, her rules. I called the county. They shrugged. It was a civil matter. I called a lawyer. He sighed. "You're looking at months of paperwork and hearings," he said. "Meanwhile, she's going to make your life miserable." And she did. Every day, I woke up to some new nuisance. Notes slipped under my door demanding membership dues. Emails accusing me of trespassing when I parked near the fence. HOA board meetings where my name was dragged through the mud, recorded and posted online by Karen herself. She wanted to make an example of me, the outsider who dared to live without her permission. For weeks, I felt trapped, both literally and figuratively. I parked my truck on the street and hiked in. I brought groceries in through the back, sometimes through a neighbor's yard. People watched but said nothing. No one wanted to cross Karen. She'd find them for less. But then, one rainy afternoon, as I trudged back from my car with a soaked bag of groceries, I noticed something odd. A small "for sale" sign, half fallen, stuck in the mud near the HOA's gate lot, that narrow strip of land where the gravel road began. The fence ran right through it. I squinted at the contact number, thinking it must be a mistake. But curiosity made me call. A tired-sounding real estate agent picked up. I asked about the parcel. He told me it was a leftover lot, technically part of the HOA's perimeter, but privately owned. The HOA leased it for access, but didn't actually own it. "No one's made an offer in years," he said. "It's basically just a gate easement." That's when something clicked in my mind. Something sharp, cold, and deliberate. I asked him to send me the paperwork. That evening, I went over every document like it was treasure. The boundaries, the legal descriptions, the easement rights. The price tag was laughably low, barely the cost of a used car. Karen's HOA had been using that land for years, without realizing it could be sold out from under them. It took 2 weeks to finalize the purchase. 2 weeks of pretending to play nice while secretly signing every form, every notarized deed. When the sale cleared, I drove out to the county clerk's office and asked for one thing: a new lock for the gate easement. My lock. Because as of that day, the gate lot wasn't HOA property anymore. It was mine. That night, I stood by the new fence, rain dripping from the brim of my hat, holding the key to the gate that Karen had installed to keep me out. The irony was almost poetic. The same fence she built to trap me had just become her prison wall. I didn't say a word to her. I didn't need to. The next morning, when the HOA's landscapers arrived and found the gate locked, they called her in a panic. She stormed down the road in her signature visor and khaki vest, clipboard in hand, barking orders until she saw the new sign bolted to the post. Private property. No HOA access without owner consent. Her face turned the color of cheap wine. She demanded answers, waving her papers and shouting for the police. But when the officers arrived and looked at the deed, they shook their heads. "Ma'am," one said, "this lot's not yours anymore." I watched from my porch as she fumed and pointed toward my house, insisting that it was a mistake, that I had stolen community land. But it wasn't theft. It was just good timing, and a perfect dose of poetic justice. For weeks, she had made me live like a trespasser on my own property. Now she was the one locked out of hers. That was the day the balance shifted. Karen didn't know it yet, but the fence wasn't just a boundary anymore. It was a line drawn in the dirt between her world of control and mine of quiet, calculated patience. And I was just getting started. For the first few days after I locked the gate, the neighborhood simmered in confusion. People drove by slower than usual, peering through their tinted windows, trying to figure out what had happened. The HOA landscapers, denied access, left a growing patch of untrimmed grass and overgrown shrubs right by the gate. It became a small jungle in the middle of uniform perfection, a blemish on Karen's carefully curated world. And that, more than anything, drove her mad. She tried to play it cool at first. I'd see her pacing near the fence, phone in hand, pretending to talk to contractors, pretending not to look in my direction. But the tension was building. The HOA had a schedule, and every missed landscaping day, every uncollected bag of leaves, was a failure that reflected on her leadership. And in the world of HOAs, image was everything. A week after the lock went on, a new notice appeared taped to the fence. This time printed on official HOA letterhead, with Karen's signature scrawled in thick, angry ink. It accused me of interfering with community maintenance operations, obstructing access to common property, and creating a hostile environment. It demanded that I remove the unauthorized lock immediately. I took the notice down, folded it neatly, and filed it away with the growing collection of her paper tantrums. The next morning, she escalated. The sound of drills woke me up. I looked out my window and saw 2 men in HOA polo shirts attempting to remove the lock with power tools. They hadn't even checked the deed. They just assumed they could take what they wanted. It didn't take long for the sheriff's deputy to arrive. I had called ahead, anticipating exactly this. Watching them explain to Karen that they couldn't legally tamper with property that wasn't hers was a quiet kind of satisfaction. She turned crimson as the deputy pointed to the boundary marker, then at me, then back at her clipboard. He wasn't unkind, but his tone carried that weary finality of someone who had seen too many neighborhood feuds spiral out of control. When he drove away, Karen just stood there, hands shaking, glaring through the fence as if she could will it to disappear. From that day on, the HOA war began. Flyers started showing up in mailboxes, accusing me of sabotaging community unity. Someone, almost certainly Karen, began spreading rumors that I was planning to build an unsanctioned RV park, or that I was letting my property fall into disrepair. I wasn't. In fact, I started keeping it neater than ever, mowing twice a week and repainting the trim just to spite her gossip. Then came the special meetings. The HOA board convened an emergency session to discuss legal recourse. I didn't attend, of course. I wasn't a member. But a neighbor slipped me a recording. It was pure chaos. Karen's voice dominated the room, high and clipped, filled with righteous fury as she tried to convince everyone that my purchase was invalid. She waved papers that didn't mean anything, shouted about community rights, and promised to reclaim the lot, no matter what it took. The rest of the board looked uneasy. Most of them had no idea the lot wasn't theirs in the first place. One member, a quiet man named George, asked whether the HOA had been paying taxes on it. They hadn't. The room went silent for several seconds. That's when the panic began to spread. Because if the HOA didn't own the gate lot, it meant years of community funds had been spent maintaining something they had no legal claim to. It meant Karen had overstepped her authority and possibly violated state HOA statutes. The meltdown was slow and delicious. Karen started making rounds of the neighborhood, knocking on doors, trying to rally support. She handed out petitions, framed herself as a victim, said I was blackmailing the community. But every time someone asked her how the HOA lost the lot in the first place, she dodged the question. Her allies began to dwindle, and meanwhile, I kept careful documentation. Every visit, every note, every email. The county records were on my side, the tax receipts in my name, the easement rights properly transferred. I wasn't just holding a lock. I was holding the HOA's weakest link. By early spring, the HOA had fallen behind on their maintenance schedule for the first time in its history. Without access through the gate lot, landscapers had to drive the long way around, through a different street lined with private backyards. Residents complained. Trash collection got delayed. Property values became the new obsession at board meetings. Every inconvenience, no matter how small, got blamed on me. And yet, behind closed doors, I wasn't doing anything overt. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't taunt. I just enforced my property rights calmly and legally. That infuriated Karen even more. She couldn't accuse me of aggression because there was none. Just a locked gate with my name on the deed and a quiet man who refused to bend. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. She began to dig. Through records, through zoning maps, through anything she could use to challenge the sale. I knew because one of her emails accidentally got forwarded to me. A copy-paste mistake from a neighbor she had roped into helping her. She was contacting everyone from the county assessor to the planning department, demanding to know how I had been allowed to purchase community land. Every official she reached out to sent the same response. The sale was legitimate, properly recorded, and final. When that failed, she tried something new. She filed a complaint with the Code Enforcement Office, claiming that my unpermitted fence violated setback regulations. The irony was staggering, considering it was her HOA that had built the fence in the first place. I let that play out, too. When the inspector came, clipboard in hand, I gave him coffee and showed him the original HOA work order with Karen's signature on it, a copy I'd requested weeks earlier from the contractors she hired. The inspector laughed under his breath and made a note. A week later, Karen received a citation for unauthorized construction on non-HOA land. The meltdown reached its peak that evening. Neighbors reported hearing shouting from her driveway, her voice echoing across the cul-de-sac as she ranted into her phone. The next morning, she stood by the fence again, this time with no clipboard, just a hollow stare. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. That was when I realized something important. Karen wasn't just power-hungry, she was terrified. Terrified of losing control, of being seen as weak. The HOA wasn't just her pastime, it was her identity. Every rule, every violation notice, every fine, it gave her meaning. And now that foundation was cracking, the rest of the community began to distance themselves. Fewer people showed up at meetings. Some even waved to me when they passed by, subtle acknowledgments that they knew the truth. But I also knew Karen wasn't done. People like her never admitted defeat. They escalated until someone else drew the line. And sure enough, that line was coming. Because a few days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Thick, embossed, and coldly official. At first glance, it looked like another HOA notice, but the sender wasn't the HOA board this time. It was a law firm. A big one. Karen had gone legal. The envelope sat on my kitchen table for hours before I opened it. Thick ivory paper, embossed lettering, the kind of thing designed to intimidate before you even read the first word. It smelled faintly of toner and self-importance. When I finally slid the letter out, the words inside confirmed what I'd already suspected. Karen had hired a law firm. The letter demanded immediate removal of the gate lock, reinstatement of HOA access, and payment of damages for obstruction and interference. It threatened legal action if I didn't comply within 10 business days. It was written in the polished, clinical tone lawyers use when they think they're talking to someone who will fold. But I didn't fold. I sent it straight to my own attorney, the same weary man who had warned me months ago that Karen would make my life miserable. He called me later that day, and though his tone was half amused, half exasperated, he assured me the letter was more bark than bite. "They're bluffing," he said. "They don't have a legal claim to the lot, and they know it. But they'll try to scare you into giving it back." That was fine. I could wait them out. Karen, on the other hand, couldn't. By the end of the week, the HOA's official website had a new announcement. It described an ongoing legal dispute with a hostile property owner and warned residents about potential disruptions to community maintenance. She never named me outright, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. What she didn't expect was how quickly the tide would turn against her. The more she talked, the more cracks appeared in her story. Residents began to ask uncomfortable questions about the missing tax payments, about the board's failure to verify ownership of the gate lot, about why their dues were being used to fund a lawsuit instead of community repairs. And then, almost poetically, the HOA's financial report leaked. Someone, maybe a board member tired of Karen's tirades, sent an anonymous email to the neighborhood mailing list, attaching a PDF that showed just how deep the problem ran. Tens of thousands of dollars had been spent on projects that technically violated property lines. Landscaping, security, fencing, all on land they didn't legally control. The fallout was immediate. Neighbors who once smiled politely at Karen started to avoid her altogether. Her allies on the board began to resign one by one, citing personal reasons. The HOA message board went silent. For a woman who built her world on control, silence was the worst punishment imaginable. But the law firm didn't drop the case. They filed an official complaint in county court, forcing me to respond. My lawyer handled most of it, but I couldn't help reading through the paperwork myself. Their argument was desperate. They claimed prescriptive easement rights, the idea that long-term use of the lot gave the HOA permanent access. It might have worked if not for one glaring flaw. They hadn't paid taxes or maintained a deed in decades. My lawyer filed a counterclaim for harassment and trespass. That was the moment the storm truly began. Court cases move slowly, but gossip moves fast. Within days, half the neighborhood knew there was a lawsuit. Karen tried to keep up appearances, walking her morning route with the same stiff posture and plastic smile, but the cracks were showing. I noticed how she avoided eye contact, how she stopped hosting the HOA's monthly coffee socials. Even her yard, once the envy of the block, started to slip, weeds creeping between the perfect rows of flowers. Every storm needs momentum, and this one built quietly. A few weeks later, the first court hearing was scheduled. It wasn't dramatic, just a preliminary conference. But it marked the first time Karen had to face someone who couldn't be bullied. My attorney described her demeanor afterward: restless, defensive, completely out of her depth. The judge had dismissed most of her initial claims as unsupported. It wasn't over yet, but the direction was clear. The legal storm raged for months. Each filing, each counter-motion added another layer of tension. Karen's confidence eroded in slow motion, visible to anyone who looked. The neighbors began whispering about her losing the presidency, about calling for a new election. But Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. When the legal route began to falter, she pivoted. She started using fear. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes, warning that the lawsuit's cost might force the HOA to raise dues. Some accused me of jeopardizing everyone's property values. Others claimed I was planning to fence off more land. An absurd lie that spread faster than truth ever could. Still, people were getting tired. The endless drama, the expenses, the bad press, it was exhausting them. By late summer, the HOA's attendance dropped to record lows. The once proud community newsletter shrank from glossy pages to a single black and white sheet. Karen was losing control, and she knew it. Then came the discovery phase of the lawsuit. When both sides had to turn over evidence, my attorney obtained internal HOA emails, and that's when we found it. The smoking gun. A message from Karen to a contractor, dated months before the fence went up. It read, "Don't worry about that parcel line. It's not recorded properly, and the owner won't fight us." That single line changed everything. When the document was submitted to the court, the HOA's law firm quietly withdrew. A new notice was filed days later. A motion to dismiss with prejudice. In simple terms, they had given up. The case was over. Karen's silence after that was deafening. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that weekend. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. The next morning, a notice appeared at the entrance of the subdivision announcing her resignation for personal health reasons. The perfect facade of the neighborhood queen had finally cracked beyond repair, but I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew someone like Karen doesn't disappear quietly. Sure enough, even after she stepped down, she lingered, showing up to help the new board, gossiping at the mailbox, pretending to still have authority. But without her title, without the power of the HOA seal behind her, she was just another resident, with too much time and too much bitterness. Meanwhile, I fixed up the gate lot properly. I cleared the brush, repaired the gravel, installed a neat wooden sign that said simply, "Private Access Road, by permission only." It wasn't a taunt. It was closure. The storm had passed, but the air still felt charged, like the aftermath of lightning, where the ground smells like ozone and wet dust. The neighborhood had changed. People waved again, but there was a cautiousness behind it. A shared understanding of what unchecked power could do. Karen stayed mostly out of sight after that. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her walking past the fence, slower now, quieter. The fire was still there, but dimmed. I thought it was finally over. But one crisp autumn morning, a surveyor's truck parked by the curb. He stood near the fence, clipboard in hand, measuring lines, taking photos. When I asked what he was doing, he just said he'd been hired for a private property reassessment, and I knew immediately the storm wasn't gone. It was just regrouping. The sight of the surveyor standing near the fence sent that familiar jolt of dread through me. After months of silence, months of thinking the war was over, here it was, again. The unmistakable stirrings of another move. His presence was quiet, professional, almost clinical. He didn't look like someone who cared about neighborhood gossip or board politics. He was just a man with a job, to measure, to mark, to record. But it wasn't hard to guess who had hired him. When I asked which property he was surveying, he simply said, "Lot 17 through gate parcel." That was the HOA's side of the fence, and my gate lot. He had no idea he'd just revealed Karen's latest attempt to claw her way back into control. I watched from my porch as he worked, his orange vest bright against the autumn grass. He placed flags along the property line, took pictures, and made notes. Then he left without another word, leaving behind a small plastic stake right near the gate, marked with fluorescent paint and a code I didn't recognize. The next day, I saw Karen again. It was the first time in weeks she'd ventured near the fence. She didn't look like the HOA president she used to be. No clipboard, no air of command. Her hair was pulled back messily, and she wore oversized sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. But her body language was the same as ever, tight, controlled, restless. She stood by the stake for a long time, staring at it like it was some kind of totem. It didn't take long for word to spread. By the following afternoon, the neighborhood message board was buzzing again. Someone posted that a property dispute was back in progress. Someone else said the HOA was planning a new access restoration project. It was all vague, but the undercurrent was clear. Karen was stirring things up again. I reached out to the county assessor's office just to be safe. The clerk confirmed that a boundary clarification request had been filed by none other than the former HOA president, Karen Holloway, acting as representative of concerned residents. She was trying to challenge the official boundaries of the gate lot, claiming it was improperly recorded. It was a long shot, legally baseless, but it was exactly her kind of move. When she couldn't win through force, she tried to rewrite the map. For a while, I did nothing. My attorney assured me it would go nowhere. But watching the slow creep of her influence again, the subtle gossip, the half-truths whispered over backyard fences, I realized something. Karen didn't need to win in court. She just needed to make everyone believe she could. So I made my own move. If she wanted to play with optics, I'd give her optics. Over the next 2 weeks, I transformed the gate lot. I cleared out every weed, graded the gravel, and planted a neat row of cypress trees along the fence line. I installed solar-powered lights along the access road and painted a crisp white border at the property edge. Then I added a new gate, taller, stronger, with a coated keypad and a steel latch. Finally, I posted a new sign. Private easement. Entry by written consent only. Violators will be prosecuted. It wasn't aggression. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that didn't need shouting or threats. The effect on the neighborhood was immediate. People started slowing down when they drove past. Some even stopped to compliment the improvements. They weren't siding with Karen anymore. They were watching the fallout like spectators at a slow-motion collapse. Karen must have felt it too. Her next move was bolder and more desperate. A week later, a truck from a construction company pulled up at the far end of the subdivision. They unloaded lumber and concrete posts. A few hours later, the sound of drills filled the air. When I went to see what was happening, I saw it. Another fence. This one ran parallel to mine, only a few feet away, as if she were trying to reclaim the space through sheer proximity. It was absurd. The new fence didn't follow any logical boundary. It simply mirrored mine, like a visual protest. I documented everything. The measurements, the noise, the trespass. Then I sent it to the county zoning office. Within days, they issued a stop work order. The fence construction halted, half finished. A skeletal monument to stubbornness. And still, Karen didn't stop. She started parking her car near the fence, sitting there for long stretches of time. Sometimes she'd have papers spread across the dashboard. Sometimes she'd just stare through the windshield. Neighbors began whispering about her mental state, wondering aloud if she'd taken things too far. The irony was painful to watch. The woman who had built an empire of control was now obsessed with the one thing she couldn't control. A small strip of land she'd tried to steal, and lost. Then, one morning, I woke to find the gate open. At first, I thought maybe the wind had done it. But when I checked the lock, it was clear it had been tampered with. The latch was scratched, the keypad cover pried loose. Someone had tried to break in. I filed a police report. The officer took photos, made notes, and assured me they'd keep an eye out. I didn't name Karen. I didn't need to. The implication hung heavy in the air. The very next day, Karen's car was gone from its usual spot near the cul-de-sac. For the first time in months, she disappeared completely. No more sightings, no more posts, no more rumors. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe she'd finally given up. But when the county's official response to her boundary clarification request arrived, it became clear why. The letter stated, in no uncertain terms, that the property boundaries were valid, final, and legally enforceable, and that any further challenge would be considered frivolous. She had lost again. A few days later, the new HOA president, a mild-mannered man named George, stopped by to introduce himself. He was polite, apologetic, and visibly tired. He said the board was restructuring and wanted to move forward peacefully. I told him I had no interest in making trouble. He smiled, said he understood, and that was that. For the first time since I'd moved there, peace actually felt possible. Winter came, and with it, quiet. The fence stood tall, the gates secure, the cypress trees growing straight and strong. I could almost forget the chaos that had built it all. But sometimes, at night, I'd still see faint headlights slowing near the corner, idling just long enough to make my stomach tighten. Then they'd drive off into the dark. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe Karen hadn't disappeared as completely as everyone thought. Because a few months later, when the snow began to melt, I found something new by the edge of the gate. Half buried in mud, a small laminated note pressed against the fence. The handwriting was unmistakable. Angular, sharp, the kind of script that demanded attention. It said only 3 words. Not over yet. The note sat in my hand for a long time, the edges damp from the melted snow. 3 words, nothing more, not over yet. It didn't surprise me. Karen had never been the type to vanish quietly. She wasn't built for surrender. Control was oxygen to her, and the loss of it must have been suffocating. Still, there was something different this time. A kind of cold finality in those words. It wasn't another threat of action. It was a promise of resentment. A quiet, festering kind that lingers long after the shouting ends. I took a photo of the note and filed it away with everything else. The HOA notices, the letters, the court filings. My record of the entire saga sat neatly in a binder now, labeled and chronological. A full history of the fence war, preserved like evidence in a museum of misplaced power. Then I burned the paper note itself in a metal bucket behind my shed, watching it curl and crumble into black dust. Winter passed into early spring, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe again. The snow melted, the lawns turned green, and the board under George's leadership actually became functional. The new HOA was quieter, more reasonable. They fixed potholes, handled trash collection, even sent out a survey asking for community input. Something Karen would have called chaotic or unmanageable. For once, Things were normal, but Karen wasn't entirely gone. I'd catch glimpses of her car every now and then, parked at the far end of the cul-de-sac, engine idling, never for long. She didn't interact with anyone. Some neighbors said she'd sold her house. Others said she was renting it out and living with family in another town. No one seemed sure, and no one really cared to find out. The silence she'd left behind was too valuable to disturb. Then, one afternoon in late April, I got a call from my lawyer. The county had completed its final inspection of the gate lot, verifying all boundaries and easement lines. My ownership was now permanently recorded, locked into the county's digital registry. That meant no one, not Karen, not the HOA, not anyone, could ever contest it again. It was official, irreversible. It felt strange, that finality. After so long living under tension, the absence of it almost felt hollow. For months, every creak in the fence, every unfamiliar sound outside had felt like the start of another confrontation. Now, there was nothing left to anticipate. Just quiet. Real, deep quiet. So, I decided to finish what I had started. The next weekend, I hired a crew to reinforce the perimeter one last time. They installed concrete posts beneath the main gate, poured fresh gravel on the access road, and added security cameras at both ends. Not out of paranoia, but principle. The final touch was a new custom-made metal gate sign, polished and simple. It read, "Private Road. No HOA access. Permanent easement closed." The message was direct. Unarguable. When the work was done, I stood by the gate and looked out across the neighborhood. The same street that had once been lined with judgmental stares now felt strangely still. The lawns were perfect again, the fences freshly painted, but there was a subtle shift in the air. People had learned something from all this. Maybe not about property law, but about power. They'd seen what happened when someone like Karen got too much of it, and how quickly it could unravel. It was poetic, in a way. The fence she'd built to keep me out had become the symbol of everything she lost, a monument to her own overreach. In the months that followed, the HOA adjusted to its new boundaries. They rerouted the maintenance path around the long way, using an alternate access that cost them more in landscaping fees, but no one complained. The new board accepted it as a lesson learned. Property lines weren't just lines. They were limits. Then, one day, a for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's old house. The grass around it had gone a little wild. The shutters were fading, and the once perfect garden she'd obsessed over was choked with weeds. The listing stayed up for months before it finally sold, below market value. When the moving truck came, no one went out to say goodbye. No one even opened their curtains. It was as if the entire neighborhood had silently agreed to erase her presence. After she was gone, things got better. The HOA stopped feeling like an institution and started feeling like what it was supposed to be, a group of neighbors looking out for their street. The community events came back, simple and unpretentious. Kids played near the cul-de-sac again. People smiled when they passed by, but even peace leaves shadows. Every now and then, I'd notice small reminders of what had happened. A patch of fence still bearing the faint marks where the old HOA lock used to hang. A faded "No Trespassing" sticker peeling off the corner post. Ghosts of the feud, embedded in wood and memory. One evening, months after Karen's house had sold, I stood by the gate as the sun went down. The light cut through the cypress trees, long and golden, and the air was still. The new owners of her home were hosting a barbecue. Laughter drifted faintly through the quiet streets. I could smell grilled food, hear music playing softly. Life was moving on. And yet, as I leaned against the post, I felt the faintest sense of poetic closure. All those months of fighting, all the paperwork, all the sleepless nights. They had built this piece, brick by brick, one boundary at a time. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about reclaiming space from the kind of control that feeds on fear and compliance. The last embers of Karen's empire had burned out quietly, with no grand finale. No final confrontation, no last-minute redemption arc. Just a woman who pushed too far, lost everything, and faded into silence. I locked the gate one final time and turned the key slowly, hearing the latch click into place. The sound was sharp and clean, a perfect punctuation mark to the story. Behind that gate was my land, my peace, and my proof that even the loudest bully could be outdone by quiet persistence. As I walked back toward my house, the lights from the new HOA meeting glowed faintly through the community center windows. George's voice carried softly through the air, calm and measured. For the first time, it didn't sound like authority. It sounded like reason. And as the crickets started to hum and the streetlights flickered on, I realized something simple. Karen had built a fence to keep me out. But in doing so, she'd walled herself in, trapped by her own obsession with control. Now, the gate was mine. The land was mine. And the peace that came with it? That was mine too, locked, secure, and quiet, for good.